Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. We love to tackle the big topics here, and today we're taking on something that I think will really resonate with this audience. I
Yeah.
think we've got a lot of philosophical minds out there, and that's the phenomenology of religion.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, and we're not just talking about belief systems or rituals and practices, but we're really going deeper, right to the heart of what it feels like to have a religious experience. That subjective awareness. And luckily for us, we've got some really great sources that grapple with this exact intersection of personal experience and the sacred.
Yeah, it sounds like we're going to try to figure out what role these subjective experiences play in religion, right? How
Yeah.
important are they really? And I'm especially intrigued by the idea of, teasing apart what makes these experiences so unique, what kind of emotions are tied up in them, and even, how they might connect to the physical world around us.
Absolutely. And I think you bring up a great point there about teasing it apart,
Yeah.
because that leads us right into a core challenge, which is like, how do you even describe a religious experience in the first place?
Yeah.
Like, how do you put words to something so intensely personal and often so profound? Thinkers like William Alston and William James,
Yeah.
they really wrestled with this idea of ineffability,
Hmm.
that sheer difficulty of trying to articulate what a mystical experience is actually like.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating because when you think about it, right, like comparing that to, just our regular everyday sensory experiences, there's a stark difference.
Totally.
Like we can all talk about, what it feels like to feel warm because we can point to the source of that, feeling the heat, and we have the words to express it. But with these mystical experiences, it's not so simple, right? There's not always a clear-cut, external thing causing the experience that we can all agree on, and that makes it much harder to even begin to describe it.
Yeah.
And Austin really highlights this, right? He says, look, just because we don't have this neat and tidy vocabulary for mystical experiences doesn't mean they're not real or valid, especially when you're talking about a personal God, which is central to many religious traditions. It's not like you can, just conjure up a set of sensory inputs in a lab and expect to replicate a genuine encounter with a divine being conceived of as personal.
Let's say that there's something more there, right?
Yeah.
Something that goes beyond the physical.
Right.
But then on the other hand, we do see within certain traditions like Christianity, a pretty developed vocabulary for describing these inner states.
Oh, absolutely.
There's this whole concept of spiritual sensations, which are kind of mapped onto our familiar senses, like touch, sight, taste, smell, even hearing.
Yeah, and Nelson Pegg dives deep into this. He points out that even within Christian mysticism, you have all these distinct categories of experience, like the prayer of quiet, the prayer of union rapture, and each one is said to have its own unique phenomenology.
So are they saying that like each one feels distinctly different?
Yeah, that's the idea. It's like they're trying to capture these subtle nuances in the way these experiences are felt.
Interesting.
Like
Yeah.
take the prayer of quiet, for example.
Okay.
Pike describes how the sense of God's presence is often felt kind of within the body in that same space where you typically experience your own sense of self, and the sensations that come with it, they can be, similar to ordinary sensory perceptions like hearing or smelling, even feelings of warmth.
So they're drawing these parallels between our everyday sensory experiences and these deeper spiritual ones. But even with this vocabulary, I mean, as Pike points out, there's still this fundamental limitation.
Well, for sure.
Like you can't truly grasp what these spiritual sensations are actually like
Yeah.
without having experienced them yourself.
Yeah.
It's like trying to explain the taste of pineapple to someone who's never tasted it.
Exactly. You just can't fully convey it with words.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, though.
Yeah.
The fact that we find similar patterns and descriptions across different people's mystical accounts, that in itself offers a kind of validation.
I see what you mean, yeah.
It suggests that there's something real being experienced, even if the full depth of it remains elusive to those who haven't had that firsthand encounter.
It's like a shared reality almost.
Right.
That only some people have access to.
And it hints at a potential connection between, where you are, their spiritual journey, and the specific kind of phenomenology that you might encounter.
Now, this is where I think things get really interesting from a philosophical standpoint,
Right.
because thinkers like Stace and Pike, they try to separate the core phenomenological content of the experience from any doctrinal interpretations that are later layered on top of it.
Yeah.
So, like, is it possible that some religious traditions might actually prioritize those theological implications over the raw account of what the experience actually felt like?
Oh, that's a big question, right? Like, what's the real focus here? And Pike, specifically, when talking about the Christian mystical tradition, yeah, he's skeptical that it's just about, propping up doctrine.
Hmm.
He suggests that there's a genuine spiritual reason for meticulously recording those phenomenological details. It's about charting your progress on your spiritual path.
I see.
So, those subtle shifts in your inner experience, the way you feel God's presence,
Yeah.
that becomes a marker of how far you've come, not just, how well you grasp the intellectual concept.
So it's like a lived embodiment of the theology almost.
Precisely.
But this also raises the possibility of, what Pugmire calls corruptions, where people might seek out these experiences for less than pure motivations.
Oh, yeah.
Like for a sense of drama or self-importance.
Right. It's like, are they really after spiritual growth, or is it about ego gratification?
And that brings up some serious concerns about the emphasis on humility in many religious traditions,
Yeah.
right? And epistemically, it's worrying
Yeah.
because are we maybe unconsciously generating these feelings ourselves because we want to have them?
Right.
So how do we even know if they're genuine?
And that's where, the idea of testing those experiences by their fruits becomes really important, as Alston suggests.
Right.
Like, if your supposed religious experience doesn't lead to any noticeable positive changes in your behavior or your, compassion towards others,
Yeah.
then maybe it's time to question its authenticity. There's this underlying suspicion that if we're valuing these experiences for their own sake or for some kind of personal gain, then we might be inadvertently shaping their very nature.
Yeah, it's like we're almost tainting the well by approaching it with the wrong mindset.
Exactly.
And it's also worth noting something that Pike points out, which is that even when people use language that sounds very theoretical to describe their experiences,
Mm-hmm.
like saying, I was aware of the presence of a powerful spiritual being,
Right.
they might still be trying to directly communicate the raw phenomenological content,
Yeah.
rather than just adding an interpretation after the fact.
Yeah, it's a subtle point, but really important. Like,
Yeah.
the quality of the experience itself might naturally lead to that kind of language. It's
Uh-huh.
not like they're starting with a blank slate sensation and then slapping a theological label on it.
Mm-hmm.
The feeling might inherently be one of, being in the presence of something vast and powerful. And
So now we come to this really fundamental philosophical debate,
Mhm.
which is, can theistic meaning itself,
Okay.
that this is God or this is the divine element,
Right.
can that ever be a direct part of the phenomenology of the experience?
Ah.
Like, can you just feel it intrinsically, or is it always an interpretation that's added later?
Yeah.
Forgy and Zangwill, they argue that it can't be a direct part of the experience.
Yeah.
They say that pronouncements like that are always interpretations that we apply to the experience.
Mhm.
And they contrast this with how we recognize things in our everyday lives. Like when we see a friend,
Yeah.
we don't typically infer their presence from just, raw sensory data.
We just see them.
Yeah, we just recognize them immediately.
Right.
So they're saying that with religious experience, it's not that simple.
Yeah, this is really a core issue in the philosophy of religious experience, right?
Yeah.
And their argument is that concepts like God or omnipotence, they're just too abstract, too conceptually loaded to be directly felt or perceived in the same way that we perceive, sensory information.
Okay.
They require a level of understanding, a theological framework that goes beyond just the immediate sensory or affective content of the experience itself.
So it's almost like there has to be some pre-existing belief system in place to make sense of it in those terms.
Right.
And this leads to the view put forward by Stace,
Okay.
that maybe theistic and non-theistic mystical experiences, they actually share a common core phenomenological content. Something like an undifferentiated unity,
Okay.
but that they get interpreted differently through the lens of different religious traditions.
Right.
And he also brings in this distinction between introvertive and extrovertive mystical experiences.
Yes.
So how do you see those as playing into this discussion?
Well, what's really intriguing about Stace's take is that he suggests that introvertive experiences, those that are, directed inwards towards this pure, undifferentiated consciousness, they might actually lack any specific phenomenological content in the way that we normally understand it. It's almost like the act of describing a specific phenomenology implies a subject-object distinction which these experiences are supposed to transcend.
So it's like you're trying to pin down something that's inherently beyond definition.
Right. It's
Yeah.
like Plotinus's concept of union with the one, right? A complete merging that dissolves individual consciousness and with it any specific sensory or affective qualities.
But then you have a completely different perspective from Katz, who argues that it's not just that our faith tradition shapes how we report an experience,
Yeah.
but that it actually changes the very character of the experience itself.
Absolutely. He's saying that the conceptual frameworks, the doctrines, the whole cultural background we bring to the experience,
Right.
they're not just filters, they actually actively structure and constitute the experience itself.
Hmm.
It's not like we have this neutral, raw experience that then gets interpreted through different lenses.
Hmm.
Those lenses actually shape the light itself, so to speak.
So he's saying that our background beliefs are actually constitutive of the experience itself.
Exactly.
And then John Hick takes this even further.
Good.
He's got this very Kantian perspective, and he's suggesting that religious experiences are actually structured by these tradition-specific concepts like the Trinity in Christianity or Brahman in Hinduism.
Right.
So from his point of view, Christians and Hindus aren't just, interpreting the same ultimate reality in different ways.
Yeah.
They're actually encountering it in different modes within their experience,
Mm-hmm.
shaped by these different conceptual schemes.
Yeah, and he uses this really helpful analogy to explain this.
Okay.
He compares, an infant and an adult looking at the same room.
Okay.
So while the purely retinal image might be similar in some abstract sense, the adult's experience is so much richer, right? It's filled with concepts like table chair spatial relationships that the infant just doesn't have yet.
They don't have the conceptual framework to understand it in the same way.
Exactly. And similarly, Hick is saying that our religious concepts, which are developed within these specific traditions, they organize and give meaning to our encounters with what he calls the real.
So it's almost like we're building up to an understanding of the real through these different lenses.
Right.
But this whole idea that our phenomenology is, culturally determined, it does raise some tricky questions, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Like Sober, he points out that if our religious experiences are entirely shaped by our social and religious context,
Right.
why not just say that they're purely cultural products with no real connection to any kind of mind-independent reality?
Right. And that's the big challenge to Hick's religious pluralism.
Yeah.
If there's no real convergence across traditions on the nature of this real,
Right.
if it stays completely unknowable and beyond our, tradition-specific categories, then it becomes hard to argue that these experiences are genuine encounters with something that's actually out there.
Right. It's like we're reducing religion to just this internal, culturally fabricated thing.
Exactly.
And of course, there are theological objections to Hick's view as well.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, believers generally hold that their sacred symbols, the content of their experiences, they
Mhm.
do have some grounding in ultimate reality
Right.
and the nature of the divine.
And the idea that they're just, conceptual frameworks that could really undermine the foundation of their faith.
Yeah. It's like saying that their deepest experiences are just a kind of illusion,
And it could even impact, the motivation for religious life.
right? Like, why bother if it's all just made up?
Exactly.
So just to recap this first part of our dive,
Yeah.
we've seen this whole spectrum of philosophical conclusions about the phenomenology of religious experience,
Mm-hmm.
ranging from the idea that it has no content at all to, ineffable content,
Right.
to sensory content that gets interpreted through doctrine,
Yeah.
to content that's shaped by doctrine,
Mm-hmm.
even the idea that doctrine might be obscuring the underlying phenomenology.
And it really highlights that these are deeply rooted philosophical and evidentiary disputes with huge implications for how we understand religious pluralism and the possibility of reducing religion to something else entirely.
Yeah, and I think it really underscores why understand the subjective dimension of religion is so crucial for grappling with those bigger philosophical questions about truth and reality and the nature of belief.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've spent a good amount of time exploring those intricacies of subjective experience, often in the context of, a direct encounter with the divine. But our sources also shed light on another really important aspect of religious experience.
Okay.
And that's how it occurs within and through our engagement with the material world.
Uh-huh.
So Brown, he really emphasizes that religious experience often begins with this idea of seeing in depth the religious significance of places.
Yeah, what's interesting there is that shift in focus,
Yeah.
right? It's not just about, this internal subjective state anymore, but about how we experience the world around us as religiously meaningful.
Right, like imbuing the physical world with a deeper meaning.
And this opens up a whole new way of understanding the phenomenology of religion, one that's grounded in our, embodied experience of the environment.
Think about sacred spaces, for
Yeah.
example. Iliad, he talks about their special character, how they're set apart from the profane, the everyday.
Or like they're marked off as different.
Yeah, and Barry, he elaborates on this by describing the thresholds, the journeys, the specific paths and entry sequences that are often involved in approaching these places.
Yeah.
It's like the architecture and spatial organization are designed to evoke a particular kind of experience.
Absolutely. And Barry talks about how, these physical sequences, they act as these symbolic markers of sacred ground, right?
I see
To
that.
offer a kind of protection for those who aren't initiated. And they even serve as like a trial or a preparation for those who are seeking an encounter with the sacred.
It's almost like you're being guided through a process of preparation.
Exactly. And this deliberate structuring of space, it points to a desired phenomenology, right? A sense of seriousness, focused attention, a kind of, mental and even physical preparation that shapes our encounter with the sacred. And, you could even think about Jones's work here on how architectural design can like allure us or draw us into ritual participation.
But then we have Christian perspectives, like White's argument, that for a Christian, what really makes a place religiously significant is just the presence of a Christian community living out their faith.
Right.
So it's not so much about the space itself,
Right.
but about the people who inhabit it.
And this leads Turney to make this really useful distinction between Domus Dei and Domus Ecclesia.
So for you, what are the key phenomenological differences implied by these two approaches?
Well, Turner's distinction gives us a helpful framework.
Okay.
So Domus Dei, literally house of God, it emphasizes a space that's designed to be imposing, often characterized by superior craftsmanship, with the aim of elevating the mind towards the divine.
So it's like the grandeur of a cathedral inspiring awe.
Exactly. Whereas Domus Ecclesiae, it focuses on the church as a house of the community,
Okay.
a meeting place primarily serving the needs of the congregation and facilitating, interaction and fellowship.
So one is more about the transcendent and the other is more about the communal aspect.
Right.
And Turner, he uses the medication room at the UN headquarters as a great example of Domus Dei.
Yeah.
He highlights that block of iron ore and that focused shaft of light.
Yeah, and the phenomenology there seems to be one of, quiet contemplation,
Right.
a sense of heaven touching earth, and this profound reverential seriousness.
Yeah. It's like the design itself is encouraging a specific kind of inner experience.
Precisely, the architectural elements are meant to foster a certain state of mind, a sense of transcendence, and connection to something larger than yourself.
But Turner also points out that these two models, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive.
Right.
Even within Christianity, there's often a place for, temple elements.
Especially for those who are newer to the faith,
Yeah.
who might be more readily drawn in by that sense of grandeur.
And conversely, even a Domus Ecclesia building can over time accumulate a sense of the sacred just through its connection with the life and rituals of the community.
Exactly.
It's like it gradually becomes imbued with meaning.
Yeah, it shapes our phenomenological experience of that space over time.
He tells that great story about the young Quaker who felt it was wrong to smoke in the meeting house even when he was alone cleaning.
Yeah.
And it really shows how the history and use of a space can deeply condition our experience of it.
Right.
It invites a certain kind of respect and maybe even reverence.
And Barry reminds us that sacred spaces, they also often serve as these tangible focal points for shared community values and identity.
It's like a physical embodiment of their beliefs.
Right.
And then Brown suggests that there's this middle ground
Okay.
where experiences of transcendence evoked by nature or, particularly striking buildings, they can serve as a kind of preparatory stage for more explicit Christian theological understanding.
Right, like a gateway to deeper understanding.
Yeah, the sheer beauty and majesty that you encounter.
Yeah.
It can open you up to spiritual possibilities before you even engage with specific doctrines.
Mm-hmm.
Think about the impact of medieval cathedrals, for example.
Oh.
That immense scale, the ethereal light filtering through stained glass windows.
Right, that the materials they use.
It's not just about the biblical stories they depict.
Uh-huh.
The sensory environment itself is designed to induce this this feeling of awe and wonder,
Yeah.
which can be a very powerful form of religious experience.
And von Hildebrand introduces this really profound idea that liturgy can actively shape not just our inner lives, but also our very perception of the mundane world.
So it's like it changes how we see everything.
Right. She talks about the man formed by the liturgy as being attuned to the deeper significance of earthly things,
Okay.
seeing even something as ordinary as water in its divine meaning as disclosed in baptism.
So it's like it infuses the everyday with spiritual significance.
Exactly.
Then there's the way that natural spaces can evoke a sense of the sacred.
Yeah.
Kohak gives this really compelling phenomenological interpretation of those classic cosmological and design arguments,
Mm.
grounding them in our direct experiences of the natural world.
Uh,
Like his description of the January moon, that stark white glow,
yeah.
it strips away this illusion of necessity and really brings home that concept of contingency.
Right.
And that leads to this natural feeling of Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Like, wow, this is amazing. And it didn't have to be this way.
What's really important about Kohak's approach is that he's not just presenting these, abstract logical arguments.
Yeah.
He's showing how these fundamental philosophical concepts have a life setting in our lived experience.
Right. Like they're grounded in how we actually encounter the world.
Exactly. And his idea of order in the natural world as a sphere of mindness,
Okay.
this realm of belonging that's implicitly ordered by this caring presence, it offers a much more phenomenologically rich and emotionally resonant understanding of divine presence.
Yeah.
It contrasts with those more, detached law-like interpretations of the traditional design argument.
It's not just about the laws of physics. It's about this sense of belonging and care.
Right.
He uses this great analogy of entering a familiar house and immediately sensing its order as reflecting someone's mindness, their care and intention.
Yeah.
And it beautifully illustrates this feeling of belonging and how it connects to that sense of a benevolent presence.
Uh-huh.
But someone might push back and say that Kohak's observations are just, a psychological gloss on the pre-existing philosophical concept of divine omnipresence.
Right, like from a more traditional Thomist or Swinburnian perspective.
Yeah. They might say it's just our subjective way of registering a truth that's true regardless of our experience.
Right.
But Kohak seems to be suggesting that this phenomenological content is essential for a full and meaningful understanding of that concept.
Yeah, it's like Jackson's Mary's Room thought experiment, right?
Oh, yeah.
Knowing all the physical facts about color isn't the same as actually experiencing redness.
You need that firsthand experience to really get it.
Exactly. And Kohak seems to be arguing that to really grasp the religious significance of something like divine presence,
Right.
we need to appreciate those experiential contexts where it arises and how it's lived.
It's not just about the abstract concept. It's about the lived reality of it.
Right. And this connects to Dupree's point about the importance of empathy.
Okay.
Like really entering into the lived experience of a faith tradition to understand its core concepts.
So it's like stepping into someone else's shoes to see the world through their eyes.
Precisely.
And this even has parallels in ethical understanding, right?
Absolutely.
Like Gaida argues that to grasp moral concepts like the individuality and inherent worth of persons,
Mhm.
it's not enough to just intellectually assent.
Right.
You need to understand the relevant phenomenology.
But like that deep sense of loss and wrong that we feel when we witness someone suffering. It's not
Yeah.
just an abstract principle.
So Kohak's main contribution here is this idea that these religiously resonant concepts are deeply rooted in our basic experiences of the world.
Uh-huh.
And those experiences, in turn, shape how we understand those concepts.
It's not just theological speculation. It's grounded in how we encounter and make sense of reality.
And it reminds me of Murdoch's observation that our concept of courage, it deepens and becomes more nuanced through lived experience.
Right.
So let's move on to another really important dimension of the phenomenology of religious experience.
Okay.
And that's the role of emotions.
Emotions.
Guilt, wonder, awe.
Yeah.
I mean, even the language we use to describe spiritual sensations, it's often packed with affective terms.
Right.
So it makes you wonder, could a genuine encounter with the divine, which is often conceived of as the ultimate good,
Uh-huh.
could it even leave us emotionally indifferent?
That's a fascinating question, right?
Yeah, like is there an inherent link between our emotional response and the authenticity of a religious experience?
Yeah, and just to be clear, when we talk about emotional feelings here,
Right.
we're specifically distinguishing them from other senses of feeling,
Okay.
like an intuitive sense of absence or just a purely physical sensation that lacks, intentionality or directedness. Yeah.
So it's about feelings that are directed towards something.
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, there's definitely an ongoing debate about, what exactly emotions contribute to religious experience.
Right.
And Alston, he raises this important concern that if the phenomenology were purely effective,
Okay.
we might have reason to doubt its directedness towards God specifically.
I see.
Like, we might suspect that the feeling is just a subjective response to a belief in God's presence,
Okay.
rather than a genuine direct apprehension of the divine.
So it's like the feeling is coming from the belief, not the other way around.
Right, and this aligns with what's called the thought plus feeling model of emotion,
Okay.
where you have a cognitive appraisal or thought like God is present in this moment,
Mm.
and that thought then gives rise to a corresponding feeling.
I see.
So in this view, the directedness of the emotion, the
Right.
fact that it's about something specific like God,
Right.
it comes primarily from the content of that preceding thought.
So the thought comes first.
Right. Think of feeling embarrassed. Oh, right. It's the thought of having done something socially awkward that triggers that feeling and gives it its direction.
Yeah.
But, there are more contemporary theories of emotion that challenge this sharp separation.
Okay.
They propose that emotional feelings themselves can actually embody forms of cognition,
Mm.
like they have their own inherent intellectual or representational content.
So the feeling itself contains knowledge in a way.
Right. And a good example of this is Schadenfreude.
The feeling of pleasure at someone else's misfortune.
Right. The feeling itself seems to be inherently directed at and recognizing that misfortune.
Yeah, like it's not just a random feeling of pleasure. It's specifically tied to that event.
Exactly.
So if emotional feelings have their own inherent content,
Yeah.
then the affective phenomenology of a religious experience could be integral to its God-directedness.
Right. It wouldn't just be a free-floating, undirected sensation.
Yeah.
It could be a direct felt apprehension of something divine.
And this connects to the view that emotions can be a mode of perception.
Oh, absolutely. Thinkers like McDowell and Day, they've argued for this, particularly in ethics and the philosophy of emotion.
And I think Day's example of perceiving scariness through the feeling of being scared is really helpful here.
Yeah.
It suggests that God could be made manifest to us in our felt responses,
Right.
rather than being solely an object of intellectual assent that then triggers an emotion later on.
Yeah.
And I think we have to talk about Rudolf Otto here.
Oh, absolutely.
His book, The Idea of the Holy, is so foundational for this discussion.
Yeah, his concept of mysterium tremendum et fascinans.
The holy as something that's both awesome and terrifying,
Yeah.
but also powerfully attractive.
Yeah, you're drawn to it, even though it frightens you.
And he argues that this religious dread, this feeling of awe, it's sui generis.
Yeah, it's unique. It's a distinctly religious kind of fear that can't be reduced to just natural fear.
And he really distinguishes his view from Schleiermacher's feeling of absolute dependence,
Right.
where God is often seen as the underlying cause of this feeling.
Yeah.
But Otto kind of flips this.
He does.
He argues that that creature feeling,
Yeah.
that sense of profound dependence,
Uh-huh.
it's actually a secondary effect of a primary feeling that's directed towards something entirely outside ourselves.
The numinous.
Right.
Yeah.
So for Otto, the divine is revealed directly in certain states of feeling.
And he even describes the awfulness associated with the numinous
Yeah.
as being reflected in a kind of, shuddering or trembling of the spirit.
So he's really emphasizing the physical manifestation of this.
Right. For him, God is presented non-inferentially in our affective responses,
Okay.
precisely because of their unique phenomenology.
And this is very different from, more inferential models like Plantinga's dialectical approach.
Right.
And Otto, he uses this framework to understand religious language as well.
He does.
He suggests that doctrinal claims are ultimately attempts to convey the conceptually inarticulate content of this numinous experience.
Right, like they're trying to put words to something that's ultimately beyond words.
Yeah, so for him, the very idea of God has this phenomenological root in those powerful, effective encounters.
And we see this explored further in Schlamm's defense of Otto,
Yeah.
and in Murphy's attempt to integrate Otto's ideas with, classical perfect being theology.
So this understanding of emotional feelings as a way of apprehending the sacred truths, it brings us back to that earlier discussion about experiencing religious significance in material contexts.
Right, like the profound reverence we might feel when approaching a sacred site.
Yeah.
It can actively shape how we perceive and understand that space as truly holy.
Goldie's example of, falling on ice and then developing this new fear-infused understanding of its potential dangers.
Yeah,
I think that's really helpful here
it is.
because that new understanding, it's not just an added layer of thought.
Mm-hmm.
It's deeply embedded within the feeling of fear itself.
Right.
And it totally changes how you experience icy
They
surfaces.
take on a new salience.
Yeah, they're not just slippery anymore. They're potentially dangerous.